hymn will be number 683. 683.
Good morning. If you've got your Bibles today, open up to Luke 24. Luke chapter 24. This is the week where we're supposed to talk about a message of hope and a message of joy. But 5 days ago, we were reminded that everything is not right in the world. 5 days ago, we were struck with the news of yet another terrorist attack, this time in Brussels. 5 days ago, and over the course of this last week, we are reminded of scenes of people who are mourning the loss of loved ones. People like this. We're reminded of 31 people who lost their lives at the hands of terror. We're reminded of 340 people who are injured because of what happened this week, 5 days ago, in Brussels. And so we're going to talk this morning about a message of hope and a message of joy and a message of love. But we're reminded at the same time that this life is not like it should be. We're reminded at the same time that there are a lot of things that are wrong in this world. We're reminded that this world is not like it should be, but there's something we'll talk about today that's going to help us out in coming to grips with what we go through in this life. 5 days ago, we are reminded of pain. We're reminded of pain that comes at the hands of other people. We're reminded 5 days ago of pain that comes into our homes, into our marriages. Reminded of pain that comes into our lives, into our families, in our relationships. 5 days ago, we're reminded of agony that people all over our globe will suffer sometimes. 5 days ago, we're left with questions like, why do people do things like this? We're left with questions 5 days ago about what do we do in response to things like this? And maybe the hardest and biggest and most difficult question of all that we're left with is, why does God allow stuff like this to happen? Maybe the hardest question we're going to answer in life is, why does this good God that we love and we care about and we believe loves us, why does this God that we trust and we believe in, why does God let things like this happen? And why does God let things like this keep happening? And what do we do? How do we respond whenever things like this go on in our world and in our lives and in our homes and in our marriages, in our emotions? How do we respond when we're asking God and trusting God and believing God is going to do something, but we're still stuck with the same problems we had yesterday? How do we make sense of life when life doesn't make sense? Today we're going to try to sum this whole series we've talked about through the month of March. We're going to try to bring it all to a close, and we're going to try to make sense of life by looking at something in life and something in history that makes absolutely no sense at all. We're going to try to answer all these questions that we have about God. Why does God make me wait? Why does God seem distant? Why doesn't God cooperate with my plans? We're going to try to make sense of the mess of life by looking at something that does not make sense at all. Sometimes in life, you'll have pain. Sometimes in life, you'll agonize over things. You'll be miserable at some point. Sometimes in life, you're going to suffer. You're going to be angry. You're going to be confused and wonder about why God allows these certain things to go on. And in those times, it's normal to doubt God. During those times, it's normal to have these questions about, why does God allow this to happen to people like us? Why does He allow the pain and the suffering and the agony and the misery and the confusion? Why does God do these things in our lives? 5 days ago, terrorists on the other side of the world reminded us of those emotions, pain and agony and misery. 5 days ago, we brought these questions back to our mind about, why do things like this happen in our world today? And now 5 days later, that might be so far from your mind that you hadn't thought about it in days until I just brought it up. 5 days after what happened in Brussels that kills 31 people and injures 340 people, that might be the furthest thing from your mind right now. And maybe when I bring that to light, it kind of shocks you that we maybe have become so numb to these events, so numb to the pain and the agony and the suffering in our world that things like this don't even register with us anymore. And maybe our numbness this morning to that stuff is a reminder still that the world is not as it should be. Everything is not right. We're going to try to make sense of it. And if we're going to try to make sense of the pain and the suffering and the agony this morning, then we've got to look at something that doesn't make any sense at all. The death and burial, the resurrection of Jesus, they happened over 3 days. Friday was the death. Saturday, Jesus is buried in silence all day, and then Sunday morning, he's not there. Friday is the day of the crucifixion. Friday's the day of pain. Friday's the day of agony for Jesus and his followers because they don't know where he is. They don't know where he's going to be. They don't know what's going to happen to him after this crucifixion. They're thinking maybe we've backed the wrong guy. Maybe he's not who he said he was. There's pain, there's agony. Saturday, he lies in the grave, and there's confusion, and there's doubt. Is Jesus really who he said he was going to be? How can the Son of God be killed by mortal men? All these questions might come to their minds. There's pain, there's agony, there's doubt, there's confusion. But Sunday's coming. And Sunday was the day that was all about joy. After the pain and agony, confusion, doubt, Sunday's the day that's all about hope. And it's all about victory over death. And the fact of life is just like the disciples faced the pain and agony of Friday and the doubt and confusion of Saturday, just like they faced all those emotions, we'll relive those 2 days in our lives as well. There will be times of doubt. There will be times of confusion about where's God in all of this. There will be times when we question the plan of God and question what God is doing. There will be times in our life of pain. There will be times of agony. There will be times when we have physical pain. There will be times when we lose loved ones. There will be misery over some kind of situation in life. And so what do we do in those days of pain? We're going to have them. What do we do in those days of agony and misery? How do we make it through the days of doubt? How do we press on through the days of confusion about what is God doing? How do we make it from Friday? How do we make it through Saturday? How do we make it to Sunday where there's hope and where there's joy and where there's life and where there's victory? Sometimes life doesn't make any sense. Sometimes the pain doesn't make any sense. The agony, the misery, the confusion, the doubt. We wonder, where's God in all this? And we think this doesn't make any sense. Why would God allow this? How do we make it through Friday and Saturday and finally come to joy and hope and victory on Sunday? Hard questions, difficult questions, but they all have one answer. You read about it in Luke 24. All the answers are in the empty tomb. Verse 1, on the first day of the week, at early dawn, they went to the tomb. They take the spices they had prepared. They found the stone rolled away from the tomb. When they went in, they did not find the body of Jesus. While they were perplexed about this, behold, 2 men stood by them in bright or dazzling apparel. And as they were frightened and bowed their faces to the ground, the men said to them, "Why do you seek the living among the dead? He's not here, but he is risen. Remember how he told you while he was still in Galilee that the Son of Man must be delivered into the hands of sinful men and be crucified, and on the 3rd day rise?" And they remembered his words, and returning from the tomb, they told all these things to the 11 and to the rest. And now it was Mary Magdalene and Joanna and Mary, the mother of James, and the other women with them who told those things to the apostles. But these words seemed like an idle tale, and they didn't believe them. But Peter arose and ran to the tomb, stooping and looking in. He saw the linen clothes by themselves, and he went home marveling at what had happened. It's a strange story. If we're honest with ourselves, it's something that really doesn't make any sense at all. But if we're going to make sense of life, and if we're going to talk about these hard questions, difficult problems in life, if we're going to make sense of the mess, then we've got to talk about something that doesn't make any sense. Because that's the only way to make sense of our lives. One of the things that we deal with in life is that we want everything to make sense. And when you think about the last days of Jesus, the Friday, the Saturday, the Sunday, everybody's just doing what makes sense to them. You look in the Gospels and Jesus dies on the cross on Friday, and they take his body down. And they find a tomb, Joseph's tomb, because it makes sense. You got to lay the body somewhere. And they plan to anoint his body with spices like they did during that time because that's what makes sense to them. They get his body, they take it to a tomb, and they bury their dead. because it makes sense. And even on the other side of that, Pilate, the one who's very much responsible for the death of Jesus, the Roman governor there, Pilate does what makes sense. He knows who Jesus is. He knows that Jesus has a following, and he knows that Jesus, his body would be in danger of being taken by somebody from the tomb. And so Pilate does what makes sense. He puts guards at the tomb of Jesus to make sure that none of his followers are going to come by and grab the body and make it look like he resurrected on the third day. He does what makes sense. Even when you come to the story in Luke chapter 24, at the tomb of Jesus, everybody's doing what makes sense. First of all, nobody's there. Nobody's at the tomb waiting for Jesus to come back to life. Even though over and over and over again, Jesus told them, I'm going to die, and then 3 days later, I'm going to rise again. 3 days later at the tomb, nobody's there waiting on Jesus to come to life. Because it doesn't make sense. It makes sense to them that he's dead and he's not going to come back. That's what makes sense to them. And then as you go through the story in Luke chapter 24, you read through it, and when you get down to verses 2, 3, and 4, everybody's still doing what makes sense. They come to the tomb, they see the stone rolled away, and they see nobody inside the tomb, and their first thought is not, oh, Jesus resurrected like he said he would. Their first thought is, they've taken his body, and I don't know where he is. Their first thought is that he's been stolen, not resurrected. Why? Because that's what would make sense to them. It makes more sense that somebody took his body other than him being resurrected. The stone has been taken away. The sealed stone has been removed. The followers of Jesus are confused. They're wondering. They're perplexed. They don't have any idea what's going on here because it doesn't make sense to them. Look down at verses 11 and 12. And so the women who were there, and they're told by these people in dazzling apparel, why seek the living among the dead? He's not here. He's risen. And so they go tell the rest of the disciples. And you know what happens when they go back to the followers of Jesus, the ones who had been around him for years and the ones who knew the story, the ones who knew what he was talking about, I'm going to die, 3 days later rise again. The women tell them that's exactly what's happened. He's not there. He's risen. Why seek the living among the dead? And they go back, and my Bible says that the other disciples heard that as an idle tale. And our translators have dressed that up for us a little bit. The original is that the other disciples heard that as garbage. They heard it as junk, nonsense. It doesn't make any sense that Jesus was alive and then dead, and now Mary and the others are saying he's alive again. The whole thing just sounds like nonsense to them. And then after Peter runs to the tomb and he looks inside and he sees for himself, he goes home, and the Bible says that he's still marveling. He's wondering. He's confused about all this. Why? Because it doesn't make any sense. This whole story doesn't make any sense. And we usually want things in our lives to make sense. With God, sometimes it doesn't. Over the last 3 or 4 weeks, we've seen how this plays out in life. We want life, and we want God, and we want stuff to make sense for us. We talked about the story of Lazarus and how by our schedules and our calendars, we want God to do something, but sometimes in our mind, God shows up late. Lazarus dies, and that doesn't make sense to his family, but it makes sense to God. He had a greater purpose. We talked about last week the story of Paul and how Paul's got this thorn in the flesh, and it makes sense to us that Paul, the great apostle, could pray to God and ask for this thorn to be removed. But Paul said 3 times, I prayed about that, and it was still there. It doesn't make sense to us. We want God to cooperate with our plans. When he doesn't, it doesn't make sense. We started this whole thing off talking about John the Baptist. John the Baptist put in prison, eventually beheaded for standing up for the truth, and he sends word to Jesus, remember? And he says, are you the one we're supposed to be looking for, or is there somebody else? And Jesus' response was, go tell John that the blind people see, the deaf people hear, the mute people can talk, the lame people, they can walk again. And in the mind of John the Baptist, the blind people get a miracle, the deaf people get a miracle, the lame people, they get a miracle, they can walk now. Here I am in prison, about to be beheaded, and my cousin, friend, Jesus, is going to leave me here. Sometimes God seems distant. And it doesn't make sense. Even me reading that story, and I still wonder, why can Jesus heal the sick and heal the blind and heal the deaf, but his friend and cousin John the Baptist goes to his death because this girl asks for his head on a platter? How does that make any sense? I don't know. But I know God has a purpose, and sometimes his purpose doesn't line up with our plans. And so from our side, it seems like God is late, or God is distant, or it seems like God doesn't cooperate with our plans when we don't do exactly, or when he doesn't do exactly what we want him to do. But we believe in him, and we trust in him, and we pray to him about it, and we wait. We wait, still believing, still trusting, still praying, and we wait for God to do something. And whether it's something about cancer, or something about a sickness we have, or you want children, you don't have children, you're praying about that, a pregnancy, maybe it's some kind of failure in your life, maybe it's divorce or migraines or arthritis, physical pain, emotional pain, relational pain, whatever it is. You're praying about it, you're hoping in God, you're trusting in God, you're believing in God, but you're not yet getting what you're looking for. And like everybody else, you start to wonder, why doesn't this make any sense? We want life to make sense. And what we usually mean by that is we want God to do what we want. But sometimes life doesn't make sense on our side. Sometimes life doesn't make sense to us. And when you look at the empty tomb on Sunday morning, the empty tomb on the surface, that doesn't make any sense. Doesn't make any sense to the disciples, doesn't make any sense to Pilate, doesn't make any sense to the women at the tomb, it doesn't make any sense to anybody on this side. But in the end, you'll see that it really does make sense. It really makes a lot of sense. The empty tomb might not make any sense, but it makes all the difference in the world. Go back to Luke chapter 24, and you see these people, and they come to the tomb, and they're expecting to find Jesus there still dead. The only people that show up at the tomb are people ready to take care of a dead body. They've got spices. They're going to anoint his body like they do with dead people. And as they come and they see the empty tomb, they wonder, where's Jesus? They've taken him, and I don't know where he is. The men in dazzling apparel there, they say, why are you looking for the living among the dead? He's not here. He has risen. And if you look at some of those verses 4 through 8, those men, they tell these women, this is exactly what Jesus talked about. It's just as he said, they said. He said he's going to die, and he said he's going to rise 3 days later. And so what in the world are you doing here looking for someone who told you he's going to be alive in a graveyard? Look a little bit later, Luke chapter 24. Look down at verse 25. This is Jesus talking to the disciples. After the men in dazzling apparel explained it to them, here's Jesus. Verse 25, he said to them, O foolish ones, and slow of heart to believe all the prophets have spoken. Was it not necessary that the Christ, he's going to remind them, should suffer these things and enter his glory? And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them in all the scriptures the things concerning himself. Look down at verses 44 and 45. He said to them, these are my words that I spoke to you while I was still with you, that everything written about me in the law of Moses and the prophets and the Psalms would be fulfilled. And he opened their minds to understand the scriptures and said to them, thus it is written that the Christ should suffer and on the third day rise again. On the surface, what happens on that Sunday morning at the empty tomb, that does not make any sense. Not to the disciples, not to Pilate, not to anybody there. But when you look at what God was doing the whole time, when you look at what Jesus taught during his life on earth, when you look at his ministry and how he reminded those people over and over and over again, I'm going to suffer, I'm going to die, 3 days later, rise again. And when you look back through the Old Testaments, and you look at Moses and the prophets and the Psalms, Jesus shows them what just happened on that Sunday morning is what God was doing all along. It's what Moses looked for. It's what the prophets looked for. It's what the Psalms are talking about. It's what Jesus talked about in his life and in his ministry. And so he's showing them it doesn't look like it makes any sense. But really, what happened at the tomb that morning makes perfect sense. And because it makes a lot of good sense, it makes all the difference in the world. They see this empty tomb. And Jesus reminds them, this is what God was doing. When Moses said that, when the Psalms said this, when the prophets wrote about this, Jesus says, when I talked about this, this is what I was talking about. That one day I'm going to suffer for your sins and I'm going to die. But 3 days later, I'm going to rise again. Jesus says, that's exactly what I was talking about. The empty tomb is exactly where all of this was going. And that reminds us that even whenever God's plans don't seem to line up with ours, it reminds us that even when God seems late according to our schedules, it reminds us that even when God seems distant from our lives, and we can't understand why, and we see it doesn't make any sense to us, that's okay. Because the empty tomb reminds us that no matter what it's like today or tomorrow or this life, it's all going to work out in the end. The empty tomb reminds us that even though at that point in life, God seemed to be late, according to our plans, He was right on time for His purpose. The empty tomb on that Sunday morning reminds us that even though God seemed to be distant at times, He's still present with His people. The empty tomb reminds us, even though it might be uncomfortable, and even though it might be painful and agonizing and miserable, it reminds us that even though it seems like God doesn't cooperate with our plans, God's working out His greater purpose. On the surface, it doesn't make any sense. An empty tomb, a dead man now alive again, a sealed stone rolled away, none of that makes any sense on the surface. But deep down it makes perfect sense. And because it makes sense, and because it's what God was doing all along, and because the empty tomb is a result of the work of God, it makes all the difference in the world in our lives. This morning, because that tomb was empty and because Jesus is risen, there's no use in seeking life among the dead. Because Jesus rose from the grave, because the tomb was empty, there's no use in seeking real life among the death, among the decay of our world, the corruption in our world. Because Jesus rose from the grave, because that tomb was empty, we see that God brings life. And if we see that God brings life into our lives, we can stop hanging on to the dead ideas, the dead views of ourselves, the dead views of our future that we might have right now. You can seek a life with God. You can move from where you are on to bigger things, to a better life, to a more fulfilling kind of life. I'm not telling you that everything's going to make sense to you. In fact, I'm telling you that sometimes there will be things in life, pain, agony, misery, heartbreak, whatever it is, there will be things in life that don't make any sense on the surface. Sometimes you're still going to think that God is late. Sometimes you're still going to think and wonder, why doesn't God cooperate with me? You're still going to question, why does God seem distant? You're going to wonder, why doesn't any of this make any sense? But that's going to be okay now. Because even though it doesn't, you're going to know how it ends. With the story of this empty tomb, you're invited to turn away from the tomb of darkness and turn to a morning of bright light and life. I want you to think one more second about what happened at the tomb that morning. The people get there. They see the stone is rolled away. Their immediate thought is somebody's taken Jesus, and I don't know how in the world we're going to find Him. 1 second before those two people in dazzling apparel confronted them and said, He's not here, He's risen. 1 second before that, they're discouraged. 1 second before that, there's pain, there's doubt, there's confusion, there's agony. Where's Jesus? How are we going to find Him? And then they hear the gospel. He's not here. He's alive. Why seek the living among the dead? And 1 second later, those are the first people to witness the resurrection of Jesus. And this morning, even though we know about the resurrection, I can't imagine the joy and the hope and the relief in their minds when they find out that Jesus is exactly who He said He was. When they find out that Jesus accomplished exactly what He said He was going to do. I can't imagine the joy and the praise, and I can't imagine the hope in their hearts on that morning. But here's the thing. We still know about the risen Christ. We still know that the tomb was found empty that morning, and so we still have the same hope that they had that day. When we think about that empty tomb on that morning, we can move from the pain and agony of a Friday. We can move through the doubt and confusion the disciples felt on the Saturday, and we can arrive at Sunday, where the tomb is still empty, where there's hope, where there's joy, and where there's victory. We can move from Friday through Saturday to Sunday, and we can answer all the questions of life. Maybe it's the answer, I don't know why we hurt. Or maybe it's, I don't know why we have pain. I don't know why it's agony. I don't know why we have distress. I don't know why it doesn't make sense. But I know that one day, because of the empty tomb, it will. Because the empty tomb was there. Because Jesus was risen, we can stop seeking life among the dead things of this world. It's easy to sit here 2,000 years removed from the situation and make fun of those disciples. It's easy to sit back and question them. How could you not have known, after Jesus told you over and over and over again, how could you not believe that He was going to rise up? It's easy to make fun of them and say, why weren't you at the tomb that morning? He told you on the third day He's going to rise again. Why are you not there waiting for Him to come from the tomb? It's easy for us to look back and kind of make light of them, make fun of them, doubt them because of what they have done. But we can't. Because the truth is that we might have spent a lifetime doing what they did. After the death of Jesus, they go on about their lives. They go on doing things that make sense to them, taking care of a dead body, making arrangements for a dead body. They go on about their lives, acting like the resurrection didn't happen. And sometimes we do the same thing. Sometimes we're in the same boat. It didn't make sense to them, and so it wasn't making a difference in their lives. They couldn't figure it out in their minds, and so it wasn't making any kind of impact on how they went about their days. But on that resurrection morning, their lives changed forever. And whether we admit it or not, our lives changed forever too. Empowered by that empty tomb, the disciples then become courageous, and they don't flee Jesus anymore. They don't depart from Him anymore. They go out and they put their lives on the line to tell people about His life. They risk everything in their life to take the message of the gospel into the world. Because they knew the power they had in God, they were able to put their lives on the line for God. When they finally made sense of the empty tomb, they could make sense of what they were to do in their lives. When they finally made sense on that resurrection morning, it made all the difference in the world. They served a God who brought life. This morning, you serve the same God. They were questioned. Why are you seeking the living? Why are you seeking life among the dead? And I'll ask you the same question this morning. We serve the same God who brings light and brings life into our lives. And so why are we sometimes still trying to make sense of things we'll never make sense of? Why are we still seeking life among the dead things in this world? Why are we holding on sometimes to dead ideas about ourselves, dead values in this world, and a dead view of our future? Because the tomb was empty that morning, we can stop hanging on to these dead ideas. That God doesn't love me because I've done some bad things. That's a dead idea. You can stop hanging on to this idea that God doesn't love you because you're tempted and you fall to sin sometimes. You can get rid of this idea that God doesn't care about you because you're divorced or you've had problems or your life wasn't as clean as you wish it would have been. That's a dead idea. Why seek life among dead ideas like that? You can stop hanging on to this idea that you're not good enough for God. Why seek life among the dead? Ideas like I've done too many bad things for God to love me and care for me and for me to do something for Him. Because the tomb was found empty, there's new life this morning. And so you can stop listening to the voices that tell you you're not good enough, you're not bright enough, you're not got any kind of future in front of you. That's a dead voice. That's death and decay in our world. You can get rid of this idea that you just always disappoint people, you'll never amount to anything, you've got a past you can't overcome. All of those are dead ideas. Why seek life among things like that? You can find life with God. And you can move on to bigger things, to stronger faith, to a better kind of life. And even with that thought, I'm not telling you everything's going to make sense, because it's not. Sometimes life still will not make much sense. Sometimes you're still going to have pain. You're going to be miserable some days. You're going to have heartbreak in your life. But it's going to be better because you know how it ends. That empty tomb, it brings hope and joy and victory in life. And it reminds us this morning that no matter how bad things are or how bad things have been, one day they're going to be way better. Don't seek life among the dead things of this world. That empty tomb, it doesn't make any sense. I'll be honest with you. The stone rolled away doesn't make any sense. The people in dazzling apparel, they don't make any sense. The story that the women bring back from the tomb, that story still doesn't make a whole lot of sense. When you look at what God was doing, it does make sense. It makes good sense, a lot of sense. And because it finally does make sense that this empty tomb is the result of everything God is doing for His people. Trying to reconcile with His people, trying to have a relationship with His people, trying to give life to His people. That's what God does. The empty tomb is a result of that. You accept that? And it makes all the difference in the world for you. You can stop hanging on to dead ideas about yourself. It makes all the difference in the world for your family. It makes all the difference in the world for the people who love you. It makes all the difference in the world if you let it. This morning, that empty tomb, still empty. The risen Savior, still risen. But has it made a difference for you? Or have you gone back to the darkness, the decay, and the death that this world offers, that it provides? Are you still stuck thinking that you're not good enough? Are you still stuck thinking you can't live right? Are you still stuck in that kind of thinking that says you've got no future, you're always going to disappoint people, you'll never be good enough for God? That's terrible thinking. You serve a God that brought forth Jesus from the tomb. Don't you think He can do something with your life too? This morning, if you want the resurrection story, the empty tomb, to make a difference for your life, then you've got to start back at the pain and agony of Friday. You've got to know that Jesus died on that cross, bearing your sin on His shoulder. You've got to know that He was buried in that grave. 3 days later, He rises again, walking in newness of life, and He gives us the opportunity to shed our sin and our guilt and live a new life with Him. That's the difference. Maybe this morning you want to do that and you want to be a follower of Christ, a Christian. Maybe today you want to be baptized into Christ, to have your sins, your guilt, all those stains washed away. We'd love to do that this morning. Maybe today you're a Christian, but things don't make sense to you sometimes. And you started to doubt God, you're confused about God, and you want to recommit your life to God, to walk in His ways, to live by His will, to be pleasing to God. Maybe today there are things in your life, pain, agony, misery, disappointment, that doesn't make any sense to you, and you're having trouble making sense of it. Maybe you want the church, us, your brothers and sisters in Christ, to gather around you and to pray for you and pray with you about whatever is going on in your life. The empty tomb doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but if you let it, it'll make all the difference in the world. If you want to make some kind of change in your life today, please come let us know while we stand and while we sing this song.